Hi, I'm Emma, and yes, my own sister Rachel spent 3 months convincing our entire family that I was having a mental breakdown just so she could steal my inheritance. She called emergency meetings about my erratic behavior and even scheduled a psychiatric evaluation behind my back. She thought she was so clever, whispering to relatives about my concerning episodes and documenting my every move like evidence for a court case. But what Rachel didn't know was that I'd been recording everything. Every phone call, every family dinner, every hushed conversation where she painted me as unstable. Stick around, because what happened next didn't just expose her lies. It made her question her own sanity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months ago, I thought I had finally found my place in the world. My web design business was thriving. I had just landed my biggest client yet, and I was living in the most beautiful Victorian house in Bellingham, Washington. The house wasn't just any property. It was my grandmother's home, passed down to me when she died 8 months earlier. Grandma Rose had been my anchor, the one person in our family who truly understood me. While my sister Rachel commanded every room she entered with her polished smile and designer clothes, I was the quiet one, the observer, the girl who preferred coding late into the night over attending cocktail parties. The inheritance had been a complete shock to everyone, especially Rachel. Our parents assumed the house would go to their firstborn, the successful real estate agent with the wealthy husband and the perfect suburban life in Seattle. But Grandma Rose saw through all that glitter. She knew Rachel only visited when she needed something, and she knew I was the one who actually cared about preserving family history. The house meant everything to me, not because of its value, which was substantial at $400,000, but because it held decades of memories and represented the one place I truly belonged. I had been renovating the old Victorian for months, carefully restoring its original charm while adding modern touches that would help me run my business from home. The wraparound porch had become my favorite workspace, where I could code while listening to the sound of waves from the nearby harbor. Everything felt perfect, like my life was finally aligning the way it was supposed to. I should have known. That kind of peace never lasts in my family. The first sign something was wrong came during our monthly family dinner in Tacoma. I drove down from Bellingham on a rainy Sunday evening in March, excited to show everyone photos of the progress I'd made on the house. The dining room felt different that night, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify. My parents, Linda and Tom, seemed more attentive than usual, watching my every move like I might spontaneously combust. Rachel sat across from me in a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her husband David beside her looking uncomfortable in that way wealthy men do when forced to spend time with their in-laws. The conversation started normally enough. Dad asked about my latest client project, and I enthusiastically described the e-commerce site I was building for a local artisan collective. But as I talked, I noticed Rachel exchanging glances with our mother. Subtle looks that lasted just a beat too long, loaded with meaning I wasn't privy to. When I mentioned working late the previous night to meet a deadline, Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You've been working a lot of late nights lately," she said, her voice carrying that practiced concern she'd perfected during her real estate career. "Mom mentioned you called her at 2 a.m. last week." I felt my cheeks warm. I had called Mom late, but only because I'd been excited about landing a new client and forgot about the time difference. "I was just excited about the Morrison account," I explained. "You know how I get when something good happens." "Of course," Rachel said, but her tone suggested something else entirely. "It's just that calling people in the middle of the night can be concerning, especially when you sound as intense as Mom described." The word hung in the air like smoke. Intense. Not excited, not passionate, but intense. It was a careful word choice, the kind that plants seeds without making direct accusations. I looked at Mom, expecting her to clarify, but she just gave me a worried smile that made my stomach clench. I wasn't intense, I said quietly. I was happy. David shifted in his seat, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand with the kind of practiced sympathy she probably used with distraught home sellers. "We're not judging you, Em," she said, using the childhood nickname that felt patronizing coming from her adult mouth. "We're just worried. Living alone in that big house, working all hours, not really socializing with people your age. It's a lot of isolation." That night marked the beginning of what I would later recognize as Rachel's carefully orchestrated campaign. Over the following weeks, family conversations increasingly centered around my well-being. Mom started calling more, frequently asking pointed questions about my sleep schedule and whether I was eating regularly. Dad mentioned during one of these calls that Rachel had expressed concerns about me taking on too much work, suggesting I might be pushing myself toward burnout. The pattern became clear when I started paying attention. Rachel wasn't directly attacking me. She was more subtle than that. Instead, she positioned herself as the caring older sister who was simply looking out for my best interests. She mentioned to relatives that I seemed a bit scattered lately. She told our Aunt Janet, who was a nurse, that I'd been making some impulsive decisions about the house renovations. She suggested to anyone who would listen that perhaps inheriting such a large property had been overwhelming for someone fragile like me. The word fragile hit particularly hard because it was exactly what I'd been called throughout childhood. While Rachel was the strong one, the leader, the achiever, I was always fragile Emma, sensitive Emma, the one who needed to be handled with care. The label had followed me through school, through college, and apparently into my adult life, despite years of proving I was anything but breakable. What made Rachel's campaign so insidious was how reasonable it all sounded. She never said I was having a breakdown, she just worried aloud that I might be headed for one. She didn't claim I was incompetent, she simply questioned whether managing a property and a business might be too much stress for someone with my temperament. Every concern she voiced was wrapped in love and sisterly care, making anyone who disagreed with her seem callous or blind to obvious warning signs. The breakthrough moment came on a Thursday evening in late April. I was working late in my home office, debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Rachel's number, which was unusual since she typically texted rather than called. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Emma, thank goodness." Rachel's voice was breathless with what sounded like relief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, genuinely confused. "Why wouldn't I be okay?" "Mom said she called you 3 times today and you didn't answer. We were worried something had happened." I checked my phone and realized I'd been so focused on work that I'd missed several calls. It was something that happened occasionally when I was deep in a project, but Rachel made it sound like I'd vanished without a trace. "I was working," I explained. "I had my phone on silent." "For the entire day?" Rachel's voice carried that edge of concern again. "Emma, that's not normal. People need to be able to reach you, especially when you're living alone in such an isolated area." As she spoke, I heard something in the background that made my blood freeze. It was David's voice, distant but audible, and he was clearly talking to someone else. But what chilled me wasn't just that he was there. It was what he was saying. "Tell her about the insurance." David's voice drifted through the phone. "Make sure she understands the liability issues." Rachel's voice sharpened, clearly trying to cover the slip. "David's just concerned about the property insurance on the house. With you living there alone and working such irregular hours, We want to make sure everything's properly covered. But I'd caught enough of the conversation to realize this call wasn't spontaneous. They'd been discussing me, planning what to say, strategizing about insurance and liability in ways that had nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with the property I'd inherited. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word choice and inflection. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I drove to the electronics store in downtown Bellingham and purchased a small digital recorder, the kind reporters use for interviews. If Rachel wanted to document my behavior, I was going to document hers right back. The first recording came sooner than I expected. 3 days after the phone call incident, Rachel showed up at my house unannounced. She claimed she was in Bellingham showing properties to clients and wanted to check on me, but the timing felt calculated. I'd just posted on social media about completing a major project milestone, looking happy and accomplished in a photo taken on my front porch. Less than 2 hours later, Rachel was at my door. "The house is looking amazing," she said as I gave her a tour of the renovations. Her voice was warm and supportive, the perfect big sister admiring her younger sibling's accomplishments. But I noticed how her eyes cataloged everything, lingering on the paint samples taped to the wall and the tools scattered around what would eventually be a home office. "It's a lot of work for one person," she continued, running her finger along a windowsill I hadn't had time to dust. "Are you sure you're not taking on too much? This place is huge, and maintaining it along with running your business seems overwhelming." I'd started the recorder before letting her in, and I was grateful for that foresight as she continued talking. What sounded like sisterly concern in the moment would later reveal itself as something much more calculated when I played back the recording. "Have you thought about what happens if you get burned out?" Rachel asked, settling into the window seat in what used to be Grandma Rose's reading nook. "I mean, if you had to take a break from work for your mental health, how would you keep up with the mortgage payments and maintenance costs?" "There's no mortgage," I reminded her. "Grandma owned the house outright." "Right, but there are still property taxes, insurance, utilities, upkeep. It's a significant financial responsibility. And if your health suffered, mental or physical, you might not be able to work consistently enough to cover those expenses." The conversation continued for another hour, with Rachel skillfully steering the discussion toward scenarios where I might become unable to care for the property. She mentioned other cases she'd seen in her real estate career, young people who'd inherited properties they couldn't afford to maintain, families who'd lost generational homes because the heirs were overwhelmed by responsibility. "I'm just saying," she concluded as she prepared to leave. "It might be worth considering whether keeping the house is really in your best interest. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let go of something that's becoming a burden." After she left, I sat on the porch with the recorder in my hands, replaying the conversation. What struck me wasn't just the content, but the technique. Rachel had spent an hour planting doubts about my capability without once directly saying, I was incapable. She'd raised concerns about my financial stability without acknowledging that my business was thriving. She'd suggested I might burn out without recognizing that I'd never been happier or more fulfilled in my work. But most importantly, she'd revealed her agenda. This wasn't about my well-being. It was about the house. Every concern she'd raised ultimately led back to the same conclusion, that I should consider selling the property. And as David's comment about insurance liability replayed in my mind, I began to understand that this campaign wasn't just about getting me to sell. It was about building a case that I was unfit to own the property in the first place. That realization changed everything. I wasn't dealing with a concerned sister. I was dealing with someone who was systematically undermining my credibility and mental health narrative for her own benefit. The question was why? Rachel had a successful career, a wealthy husband, and a beautiful home in Seattle. Why did she need my inheritance so badly that she was willing to destroy our relationship to get it? The answer would come soon enough. But first, I had to figure out just how deep this conspiracy went and who else in my family had been recruited to doubt my stability. I also needed to understand what Rachel's endgame looked like. Was she planning to have me declared incompetent? Was she hoping I'd voluntarily check myself into some kind of treatment facility? Or was she simply trying to pressure me into selling through shame and family intervention? Whatever her plan, I wasn't going to let her execute it in the shadows anymore. If Rachel wanted to play psychological warfare with my reputation and relationships, she was about to discover that the quiet sister she'd always underestimated had been paying attention all along. And unlike her carefully orchestrated manipulation campaign, my response was going to be built on something Rachel had never bothered with: the truth. The next phase of Rachel's campaign began with what I initially thought was genuine family concern. 2 weeks after her surprise visit to my house, I received a group text from my mother that made my stomach drop. The message was simple but loaded with implications. Family dinner this Sunday. Important discussion about Emma's situation. Everyone please attend. My situation. As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person living my life. I stared at the text for a long moment, noting that it had been sent to our usual family group chat, which included me, Rachel, David, and our parents. But something felt orchestrated about the timing and wording. When I scrolled up through recent messages, I realized there had been several conversations in this group that I wasn't part of. Gaps where responses referenced things I hadn't seen. Rachel had clearly been coordinating separate discussions about me. I drove to Tacoma that Sunday with a knot in my stomach and the digital recorder tucked discreetly in my jacket pocket. The familiar route down Interstate 5 usually calmed me, but that day every mile felt like approaching a tribunal. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed Rachel's BMW was already there, along with a car I didn't recognize. Through the living room window, I could see figures gathered around the coffee table, their heads bent together in serious conversation that stopped abruptly when they noticed my car. Mom answered the door with the kind of overly bright smile she wore when she was nervous. "Emma, sweetheart, come in. We're all in the living room." Her voice carried a forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on edge. As I followed her down the hallway, I could hear the murmur of voices that quieted as we approached. The scene that greeted me in the living room felt like an intervention staged by people who'd watched too many television dramas. Dad sat in his usual recliner, but his posture was stiff and formal. Rachel occupied the center of the couch, flanked by David and a woman I'd never met. The coffee table held a notepad, several printed documents, and what looked like a folder thick with papers. Everything about the setup screamed planned confrontation. "Emma, this is Dr. Patricia Henley," Rachel said, gesturing toward the unfamiliar woman. "She's a family counselor who specializes in intervention strategies. We asked her to join us today because we're concerned about some patterns we've been noticing." The word intervention hit me like cold water. I remained standing near the doorway, suddenly grateful I'd started recording before entering the house. Dr. Henley was a slight woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the sort of measured calm that probably worked well with genuinely troubled families. But there was something in her expression that suggested she'd been given a very specific narrative about why she was here. "Please, sit down," Dr. Henley said gently, patting the empty space on the couch beside her. "Your family has asked me here because they love you and they're worried. They want to have an honest conversation about some behaviors that have them concerned for your well-being." I chose the chair across from the couch instead, maintaining some distance while trying to project calm I didn't feel. "What behaviors?" I asked, genuinely confused about what could have prompted this gathering. Rachel opened the folder on the coffee table and pulled out what appeared to be a timeline written in her neat handwriting. "We've been documenting some incidents over the past few months that paint a concerning picture," she began, her voice taking on the professional tone she used with difficult clients. "Documenting?" The word came out sharper than I intended. "You've been documenting my life?" "Not spying. Mom interjected quickly. Just keeping track of things that worried us. Rachel suggested it might help us see patterns we were missing individually. Rachel consulted her timeline and began reading like she was presenting evidence in court. March 15th, you called Mom at 2 a.m., speaking rapidly about a business opportunity and seeming unusually agitated when she suggested you call back in the morning. March 23rd, you didn't answer your phone for an entire day, causing the family to worry something had happened to you. April 2nd, you posted 17 social media updates in a single evening, all about the house renovations, which seemed excessive and manic. Each item on her list sounded reasonable in isolation, but strung together they painted a picture of someone spiraling into instability. What she didn't mention was that the late-night call had been about landing my biggest client ever, that I'd missed calls because I was focused on work, or that my social media posts had documented a particularly productive day of renovation progress that I was proud to share. April 10th, Rachel continued. You mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the property maintenance during our phone conversation. April 14th, when I visited the house, you seemed scattered and spoke obsessively about renovation details for over an hour. Dr. Henley nodded along as Rachel read, occasionally making notes on her own pad. When the recitation finished, she looked at me with practiced empathy. Emma, how do you respond to these observations? Do any of these behaviors seem concerning to you when you hear them described this way? I felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. My own life was being reframed as pathology, normal experiences twisted into symptoms of mental instability. The worst part was how reasonable it all sounded when presented by a mental health professional in a clinical setting. Those aren't accurate characterizations, I said carefully. The late call was because I was excited about landing a major client. I missed calls because I was working. The social media posts were documenting progress on a project I'm passionate about. These are normal life experiences being presented as evidence of mental illness. David shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I noticed he avoided making eye contact, instead studying the pattern on Mom's area rug like it held the secrets of the universe. Rachel leaned forward, her expression softening into what I recognized as her sales pitch face. Emma, no one is saying you're mentally ill. We're saying we're concerned about stress and potential burnout. Living alone in that big house, managing all those renovations, running your business without any support system in Bellingham, it's a lot for anyone to handle. I have support, I countered. I have friends, neighbors, business contacts. Just because I don't live in the same city as family doesn't mean I'm isolated. But when was the last time you took a real break? Mom asked, her voice heavy with worry. You're always working, always busy with house projects. Rachel mentioned you've been working late most nights, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. How Rachel knew my work schedule when she lived 2 hours away was a question I filed away for later consideration. More immediately concerning was how she'd positioned my dedication to my career as evidence of instability rather than ambition. Dr. Henley consulted her notes and looked at me with professional concern. Emma, your family has described a pattern of isolation, irregular sleep schedules, obsessive focus on projects, and what they perceive as manic episodes followed by periods of unavailability. These can be warning signs that someone is struggling to cope with stress. The clinical language made everything sound official and frightening. I realized this wasn't just an intervention. It was the beginning of something much more serious. Rachel wasn't just trying to convince the family I was unstable. She was building a case with professional documentation. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Rachel and Dr. Henley exchanged a look that confirmed my worst fears. We think it might be beneficial for you to take a break, Rachel said carefully. Maybe consider staying with family for a while, taking a step back from the business and the house renovations. Give yourself time to rest and recover from what's clearly been a stressful period. The suggestion sounded reasonable, even caring, but I understood the implications. If I agreed to step away from my business and the house, even temporarily, it would validate their concerns about my stability. More importantly, it would leave the property vulnerable to Rachel's influence during my absence. "And if I don't think I need a break?" I asked. The silence that followed was telling. Dr. Henley cleared her throat and spoke in the gentle but firm tone I imagined she used with resistant patients. "Emma, sometimes when we're in the middle of a stressful situation, we can't see it clearly, ourselves. That's why family intervention can be so important. The people who love us can sometimes see what we can't." Dad finally spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "We just want what's best for you, sweetheart. If there's a chance you're pushing yourself too hard and it's affecting your health, shouldn't we err on the side of caution?" I looked around. The room at these people who claimed to love me, who said they wanted what was best for me, and realized that none of them had asked what I wanted. They'd decided among themselves that I was struggling, brought in a professional to validate their concerns, and presented me with a solution that conveniently removed me from the house Rachel wanted access to. "I appreciate everyone's concern," I said, standing up slowly. "But I'm not struggling. I'm not burning out, and I don't need to take a break from my life. I'm happier and more successful than I've ever been. If you can't see that, maybe the problem isn't with my perception." Rachel's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of frustration before she composed herself. "Emma, please don't be defensive. We're trying to help you. By documenting my behavior without my knowledge, by bringing in a stranger to analyze my life based on information I wasn't part of providing, by staging an intervention for problems that exist only in your interpretation of my choices." Dr. Henley attempted to mediate, but I was done being analyzed and managed. I thanked her for her time, kissed my parents goodbye, and left before anyone could mount further arguments for my instability. The drive back to Bellingham felt different this time. Instead of the usual peace I found in the familiar route, I felt hyper-aware of every decision, every behavior that might be misinterpreted as evidence of whatever narrative Rachel was building. When I stopped for gas, I wondered if taking too long to choose a snack would be documented as indecisiveness. When I called my friend Mike to vent about the afternoon, I caught myself speaking in measured tones to avoid sounding agitated. That evening, I sat in my home office with the recording from the intervention playing back through my headphones. Hearing it again, divorced from the emotional impact of being in the room, revealed layers of manipulation I'd missed in the moment. Rachel had presented her timeline as objective observation, but each entry was carefully framed to support a predetermined conclusion. More troubling was how Dr. Henley had accepted this information without questioning its source or seeking my perspective on the events described. I researched Dr. Henley online and discovered she wasn't just any family counselor. She specialized in court-ordered evaluations and had extensive experience testifying in cases involving mental competency and guardianship issues. Rachel hadn't brought in someone to help our family communicate better. She'd brought in someone whose professional opinion could carry legal weight if this situation escalated. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about convincing me to sell the house or take a break from my life. Rachel was building a case that could potentially result in someone else making decisions about my property, my finances, my entire future. The intervention hadn't been about helping me. It had been about creating professional documentation of my alleged instability. But Rachel had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to control the narrative, she'd revealed her strategy too early. Now I knew what I was facing, and I had time to prepare accordingly. The quiet sister she'd always underestimated was about to show her what careful documentation really looked like. Over the next several days, I began my own investigation into Rachel's recent behavior and financial situation. If she was desperate enough to orchestrate this elaborate campaign against my mental health, there had to be a reason beyond simple sibling rivalry or family control. I started with social media, scrolling through months of Rachel's posts looking for clues about her life that might explain her sudden urgency about my inheritance. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Rachel's Instagram showcased an enviable lifestyle of expensive dinners, luxury vacations, and designer purchases. She and David appeared happy and successful in every carefully curated photo. But I'd spent enough time in the tech world to know that social media presentation rarely reflected reality, especially when someone was working hard to maintain a specific image. I dug deeper into public records, business registrations, and news articles related to David's investment firm. What I found there painted a very different picture from the wealth and success Rachel projected. David's company, Miller Financial Strategies, had been the subject of several recent investigations by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Multiple clients had filed complaints about unauthorized trades and missing funds. The firm's assets had been frozen pending investigation, and David himself was facing potential criminal charges for securities fraud. The timeline was telling. The first SEC complaint against David's firm had been filed in January, just 2 months before Rachel began her campaign of concern about my mental health. The asset freeze had occurred in March, the same month she'd started documenting my alleged behavioral issues. By April, when she'd brought Dr. Henley into our family situation, David's legal troubles had escalated to the point where their personal assets were likely to be seized as part of the investigation. Suddenly, Rachel's desperation made perfect sense. She wasn't just coveting my inheritance out of jealousy or control. She needed it to survive the financial catastrophe that was about to destroy her carefully constructed life. The house I'd inherited wasn't just valuable property to her. It was a lifeline that could help her escape the consequences of her husband's criminal behavior. Armed with this knowledge, I began to see Rachel's manipulation campaign in a new light. Every concern she'd raised about my ability to handle stress or make rational decisions could be turned back on her. She was the one facing genuine financial and legal crisis. She was the one whose judgment might be compromised by desperation. She was the one whose behavior had become erratic and manipulative under pressure. But I also realized the danger I was in had escalated significantly. A woman facing financial ruin and potential criminal exposure through her husband's actions was capable of much more than sibling rivalry. If Rachel truly believed she could gain control of my inheritance by having me declared incompetent, she might be willing to go to extraordinary lengths to make that happen. The thought sent a chill through me as I sat alone in the Victorian house that had become the center of this battle. Rachel had already proven she was willing to manipulate family relationships, falsify documentation of my behavior, and bring in professional allies to support her narrative. What else might she be capable of if she became truly desperate? That question was answered sooner than I expected. 3 days after the family intervention, I received a call from Dr. Patricia Henley's office. Her assistant informed me that Dr. Henley was required to file a report with the county's Adult Protective Services, based on concerns raised during our family meeting. The report would recommend a formal psychiatric evaluation to determine whether I was capable of making decisions about my living situation and finances. The news hit me like a physical blow. Rachel hadn't just been building a case, she'd already filed it. The intervention hadn't been an attempt to help me or even convince me to voluntarily seek treatment. It had been a professional consultation, designed to generate the documentation needed to challenge my competency through official channels. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen, looking out at the garden Grandma Rose had tended for decades, feeling the walls of my life closing in around me. But instead of panic, I felt something else rising within me. A cold, focused anger that clarified everything I needed to do next. Rachel wanted to play games with my mental health and competency? She was about to discover that the sister she'd always dismissed as fragile had been documenting her own evidence. And unlike Rachel's carefully constructed narrative of my alleged instability, my evidence was going to be built on something she'd apparently forgotten how to recognize: the truth. The battle for my inheritance, my independence, and my sanity was just beginning. But Rachel had made one crucial error in her calculations. She'd assumed I would react to her manipulation the way I always had in childhood, by retreating, accommodating, and trying to keep peace. Instead, she was about to learn what happened when the quiet sister finally decided to fight back. The Adult Protective Services evaluation was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. I received the notification through certified mail, official letterhead making the whole situation feel surreal and terrifying. The document explained that based on concerns raised by family members and supported by professional consultation, a licensed social worker would conduct a home visit to assess my living conditions and mental state. The language was clinical and cold, reducing my life to a case file number and a checkbox evaluation. I spent the days leading up to the visit in a strange state of hyper-awareness, seeing my own home through the lens of someone looking for evidence of instability. The renovation supplies that had seemed like progress markers now looked like chaos. The late-night work sessions that represented dedication to my business could be interpreted as insomnia or manic behavior. Even my carefully organized filing system might appear obsessive to someone determined to find pathology. The morning of the evaluation, I woke before dawn and spent 2 hours preparing my house and myself for inspection. Every surface was cleaned, every renovation project either completed or neatly contained. I dressed in conservative business attire, styled my hair in a way that looked professional but not overly controlled, and practiced speaking in calm, measured tones that couldn't be interpreted as agitated or defensive. Ms. Jennifer Walsh from Adult Protective Services arrived precisely on time. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes and the efficient manner of someone who conducted these evaluations regularly. She carried a tablet and a thick folder, already populated with whatever information Rachel and Dr. Henley had provided about my alleged mental health concerns. "Thank you for accommodating this visit," she said as I led her into the living room. "I know these situations can feel intrusive, but our goal is simply to ensure your safety and well-being. I'll need to tour the home, ask some questions about your daily routine, and discuss the concerns that have been raised by your family." The word safety struck me as particularly loaded. I wasn't in danger from anyone except the people who had initiated this process, but apparently my family's manufactured concerns about my mental state constituted a safety issue requiring government intervention. Ms. Walsh began with a tour of the house, making notes about everything from the condition of the kitchen to the organization of my home office. She asked about my daily routine, my work schedule, my social connections, and my plans for maintaining the property. Her questions were professionally neutral, but I could sense her evaluating my responses for signs of the instability Rachel had described. "Your family has expressed concern about your isolation," she said as we stood in my office, surrounded by the computer equipment and design materials that represented my thriving business. "They worry that living alone in such a large house without close friends or family nearby might be contributing to stress or anxiety." I gestured to the wall where I'd hung framed photos of local friends, business associates, and community connections I'd built since moving to Bellingham. "I'm not isolated," I explained. "I have an active social network here, professional relationships through my work, and I'm involved in several community organizations. My family lives 2 hours away, but that doesn't mean I lack support systems." Ms. Walsh made notes but didn't seem particularly impressed by my evidence of social connection. I realized that no matter what I showed her, she was working from a predetermined narrative provided by Rachel and Dr. Henley. My job wasn't to prove I was stable, it was to disprove their claims of instability, which was a much more difficult task. "Tell me about your work schedule," she continued. "Your sister mentioned you often work late into the night and sometimes don't answer phone calls during the day. Can you help me understand your routine?" I explained that as a freelance web developer, I often worked with clients in different time zones, which sometimes required evening calls or deadline pushes. I showed her my calendar, my project management system, and examples of the successful websites I'd created for local businesses. but I could see that my professional success was being reframed as evidence of obsessive behavior rather than career achievement. Have you experienced any significant stress or emotional difficulties since inheriting this property? Ms. Walsh asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Managing a large estate while running a business can be overwhelming for anyone. The question felt like a trap. If I said no, I'd appear to lack insight into obvious challenges. If I said yes, I'd be confirming their concerns about my ability to cope. I chose my words carefully, acknowledging normal life stresses while emphasizing my effective management of both responsibilities. Like anyone balancing multiple priorities, I occasionally feel stretched thin, I said, but I've successfully managed both the business and the property improvements without any negative impact on my work quality or personal relationships. I have systems in place to handle challenges, and I know when to ask for help if I need it. Ms. Walsh nodded and made more notes. We continued through her evaluation checklist, covering everything from my financial management to my medical history to my relationships with family members. Each question felt designed to uncover evidence of the mental health issues Rachel had planted in my file. Near the end of the interview, Ms. Walsh pulled out a folder I recognized with a sick feeling in my stomach. It contained Rachel's timeline of my allegedly concerning behaviors, Dr. Henley's notes from the family intervention, and what appeared to be signed statements from my parents supporting the concerns about my mental state. Your family has provided extensive documentation of behavioral changes they've observed over the past several months, she said, consulting the papers. Late-night phone calls, periods of unavailability, obsessive focus on house projects, unusual social media activity. How do you respond to these observations? I felt my carefully maintained composure starting to crack, seeing my own life reduced to bullet points on official documents. My normal activities reframed as symptoms of mental illness was more infuriating than I'd anticipated. But I forced myself to respond calmly, explaining the context behind each incident Rachel had twisted into evidence of instability. Those descriptions take normal life events out of context, I said. The late-night call was about a significant business achievement. The unavailability was due to work focus, something any professional might experience during busy periods. The house projects represent meaningful progress on a property I care about. These aren't symptoms of mental illness. They're signs of a productive, engaged life. Ms. Walsh listened politely but didn't seem convinced. I realized that Rachel's strategy had been brilliant in its simplicity. By providing extensive documentation of my behavior through a professional lens, she'd created an official narrative that was difficult to counter without appearing defensive or paranoid. I'll be filing my report within the next week, Ms. Walsh said as she prepared to leave. Based on today's visit and the information provided by your family, I'll make recommendations about whether additional evaluation or support services might be beneficial. After she left, I sat in my living room feeling like I'd just failed a test I didn't know I was taking. Despite my preparation, despite my evidence of stability and success, I could tell the evaluation hadn't gone in my favor. Rachel's manufactured crisis had gained official momentum, and I was running out of time to prove my competency before decisions started being made for me. That evening, I called my friend Mike Rodriguez, who lived 3 houses down and worked as a local contractor. Mike had been helping with some of the more complex renovation projects, and he'd witnessed firsthand how organized and focused I was about both my business and the property improvements. More importantly, he'd been present during some of the incidents Rachel had documented as evidence of my instability. "Emma, this is insane," Mike said when I explained the situation. "I was here the night you got that big client contract. You were excited, not manic. And those social media posts about the renovation progress? You were documenting the work for insurance purposes. There's nothing crazy about any of this." Mike's perspective was exactly what I needed to hear, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd become in this battle. My local support network could see through Rachel's manipulation, but they weren't the ones making decisions about my mental competency. The people who mattered in this process, the social worker, the mental health professionals, even my own parents, were all working from Rachel's carefully crafted narrative. "There's something else," Mike continued. "I saw your sister here a couple weeks ago, but not when she visited you. She was parked down the street, taking pictures of your house with a fancy camera. When she saw me notice her, she drove off real quick. I thought it was weird, but I didn't want to worry you about it." The revelation sent a chill through me. Rachel hadn't just been documenting my behavior. She'd been conducting surveillance of my property. The photos she'd taken could be used to support any number of claims about my ability to maintain the house, or my paranoid behavior if I mentioned seeing her around the neighborhood. "Mike, I need you to do me a favor," I said. "If you see her around here again, can you document it? Take photos, note the time and date. I think I'm going to need evidence of what she's really been doing." "Absolutely," Mike agreed. "This whole thing stinks, Emma. Your sister's up to something, and it's not about your mental health." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the day's evaluation, analyzing every question and response, wondering if I'd inadvertently provided ammunition for Rachel's case against me. But more than that, I was starting to understand the full scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just a family dispute that would blow over once emotions cooled. Rachel had engaged professional and legal systems that operated according to their own logic and timelines. Once Adult Protective Services filed their report, it would become part of an official record that could follow me for years. If they recommended additional evaluation or intervention, I might find myself fighting not just for my inheritance, but for my basic autonomy as an adult. The next morning brought an email that confirmed my worst fears. It was from a law firm in Seattle, Peterson and Associates, informing me that they were representing Rachel Collins in matters related to the estate of Rose Whitman and my fitness to manage inherited property. The formal legal language made it clear that Rachel was moving beyond family pressure and professional evaluation into actual legal action. The email requested documentation of my financial status, medical history, and property management plans. It also informed me that Rachel was prepared to file a petition for guardianship if I continued to demonstrate concerning behaviors that indicated I was unable to responsibly manage significant assets. Guardianship. The word hit me like a physical blow. If successful, Rachel wouldn't just gain control of my inheritance, she'd gain control of my entire life. My finances, my medical decisions, my living arrangements, everything would be subject to her approval as my court-appointed guardian. I immediately called my own attorney, Sarah Mitchell, whom I'd used for business contracts and the property transfer when I inherited the house. Sarah was a competent lawyer, but she specialized in business law and real estate transactions, not mental health litigation or guardianship proceedings. "Emma, this is serious," Sarah said after I read her the email. "Guardianship petitions are typically reserved for people who are genuinely incapacitated, elderly people with dementia, adults with severe developmental disabilities, people in comas. For someone your age with no obvious mental health issues, this is an extreme measure." "That's what makes it so effective," I replied. "If Rachel can convince a judge that I'm having some kind of breakdown, she can position herself as the responsible family member stepping in to protect me and my assets." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her typing in the background. "I'm going to refer you to a colleague who specializes in this type of litigation. Margaret Chen has extensive experience fighting inappropriate guardianship petitions. But Emma, you need to understand that once this process starts, it takes on a life of its own. Courts tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to protecting allegedly vulnerable adults." The referral to a guardianship attorney made everything feel suddenly real and urgent. I was no longer just dealing with family drama or even professional evaluation. I was facing actual legal proceedings that could strip away my autonomy and independence. That afternoon, I had my first consultation with Margaret Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who radiated the kind of controlled intensity I associated with courtroom fighters. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking pointed questions about timing and documentation. "Your sister has built a sophisticated case," Margaret said when I finished explaining the situation. "The professional evaluation, the family documentation, the pattern of escalating concerns. This isn't amateur hour. She's either had legal advice from the beginning, or she's naturally gifted at manipulation." "What are my chances?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Margaret leaned back in her chair and studied me carefully. "In normal circumstances, with your professional success and clear mental competency, this petition would be laughed out of court. But your sister has created an alternative narrative that's supported by seemingly credible documentation. The challenge is that proving you're competent is much harder than proving someone is incompetent." "What do you mean?" "Mental health evaluation is subjective. Your sister doesn't need to prove you're severely mentally ill. She just needs to convince a judge that you're going through a difficult period that's affecting your judgment. The inheritance adds a financial motivation that courts take seriously. If she can show that you're under stress and making decisions about significant assets that seem questionable, that might be enough." Margaret's explanation crystallized everything I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. Rachel didn't need to destroy me completely. She just needed to create enough doubt about my stability to justify temporary intervention. And once she had legal control, even temporarily, she could make permanent changes to my situation that would be difficult to reverse. "However," Margaret continued, "there's something about this case that bothers me. The timeline is too convenient, the documentation too thorough. Either your sister is remarkably prescient about mental health crises, or she's been planning this for longer than she's admitted." "What does that mean for my defense?" Margaret smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "It means we're going to do some investigating of our own. If your sister has been manufacturing this crisis for financial reasons, there will be evidence. Financial records, communications, maybe even witnesses who can testify about her behavior and motivations." For the first time in weeks, I felt something approaching hope. I wasn't just a victim reacting to Rachel's manipulation. I was about to become an active participant in exposing her scheme. And unlike Rachel, I wouldn't need to manufacture evidence or twist facts to build my case. The truth was going to be weapon enough. But as I left Margaret's office that evening, I also understood that the stakes had escalated beyond anything I'd imagined when this started. Rachel wasn't just trying to take my inheritance. She was trying to take my life. If I lost this battle, I wouldn't just lose the house and the financial security it represented. I'd lose my independence, my autonomy, and quite possibly my sanity in the process of fighting a system designed to protect people like me from people exactly like Rachel. The quiet sister Rachel had always underestimated was about to show her what a real fight looked like. But first, I had to make sure I survived long enough to win it. Margaret Chen's investigation into Rachel's financial situation moved faster than I'd expected. Within 3 days, she'd uncovered a trail of financial desperation that painted a very different picture from the successful real estate agent and wealthy wife Rachel pretended to be. The SEC investigation into David's investment firm had frozen not just business assets, but personal accounts as well. Court documents showed they were facing potential civil judgments in the millions, with criminal charges still pending against David for securities fraud and embezzlement. "Your sister is looking at complete financial ruin," Margaret explained during our second meeting, spreading bank statements and legal documents across her conference table. "Their house is leveraged to the maximum, their credit cards are maxed out, and David's legal defense alone is costing them $40,000 a month. They've been living on borrowed time and borrowed money for the past 6 months." The timeline aligned perfectly with Rachel's campaign against my mental health. Every escalation in her concerns about my stability corresponded with another financial blow to their situation. The family intervention had occurred the same week David's assets were frozen. The Adult Protective Services referral had been filed 2 days after their mortgage went into default. But here's the interesting part, Margaret continued, pulling out a thick folder of printed emails. Your sister has been in contact with a property development company for the past 4 months. Coastal Pacific Development has been planning a luxury condominium project in Bellingham, and they've been looking for waterfront properties to acquire for development. I felt sick as the implications became clear. Rachel hadn't just wanted to sell my house for quick cash. She'd already negotiated a deal to sell it to developers who would tear down Grandma Rose's Victorian home and replace it with condominiums. The property that had been in our family for 3 generations would be destroyed for profit. The preliminary purchase agreement is for $800,000, Margaret said, pointing to the contract terms. Significantly above market value because of the development potential. Your sister would have made enough money to cover their debts and start over somewhere else. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. This wasn't just about financial desperation. It was about Rachel's willingness to destroy family history and memories for money. Every argument she'd made about the house being too much responsibility, for me, every concern about my ability to maintain the property, had been lies designed to hide her plan to sell it for demolition. How is this legal? I asked. She doesn't own the property. Even if she somehow gained guardianship over me, how could she sell inherited property without court approval? Margaret's expression darkened. That's where this gets truly devious. If your sister successfully petitioned for guardianship based on your alleged mental incompetency, she could argue that selling the property was in your best interest. Courts generally support guardians who want to liquidate complex assets in favor of simpler financial arrangements. She could present the sale as protecting you from the stress and responsibility of property ownership. The legal system that was supposed to protect vulnerable adults had been turned into a weapon against me. Rachel had found a way to use my own inheritance and independence as evidence that I needed protection from myself. However, Margaret said, opening another folder. Your sister made several mistakes in her eagerness to document your alleged instability. We've found evidence of her surveillance activities, including photographs she took of your property without permission. We also have witness testimony from your neighbor about her suspicious behavior around your house. Mike Rodriguez had agreed to provide a statement about seeing Rachel conducting what appeared to be surveillance of my home. Other neighbors had noticed her as well, including Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street and kept meticulous notes about unusual activity in the neighborhood as part of her informal neighborhood watch routine. More importantly, Margaret continued, we've discovered that Dr. Patricia Henley has a financial relationship with your sister that she failed to disclose. Dr. Henley has been consulting for Coastal Pacific Development on their community impact assessments. She's been paid over $30,000 in consulting fees by the same company that wants to buy your property. The conflict of interest was staggering. Dr. Henley hadn't just been brought in as a neutral family counselor. She was financially connected to the people who would profit from my property sale. Her professional opinion about my mental state wasn't just biased, it was potentially corrupt. We're going to file a motion to dismiss the guardianship petition based on fraud and conflict of interest, Margaret explained. But we're also going to go on the offensive. Your sister's behavior constitutes harassment, potentially criminal fraud, and possibly conspiracy to deprive you of property rights. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had real weapons to fight back with. Rachel's carefully constructed case against my mental health was about to be revealed as a criminal conspiracy, motivated by greed and desperation. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 2 days after Margaret filed our motion to dismiss, Rachel showed up at my house without warning. I was working in my office when I heard her car in the driveway, the sound of expensive tires on gravel that had become associated with trouble in my mind. I activated the recording app on my phone before answering the door, a habit I'd developed since learning about Rachel's surveillance activities. She stood on my porch looking haggard in a way I'd never seen before. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her designer clothes wrinkled, and her trademark confidence had been replaced by something that looked like desperation. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, pushing past me into the house before I could invite her in or turn her away. "About what?" I asked, following her into the living room where she'd positioned herself near the window overlooking the garden. "About this ridiculous legal challenge you filed," Rachel said, turning to face me with an expression that mixed anger and pleading. "Emma, you're making a terrible mistake. I was trying to help you, and you're turning it into some kind of conspiracy theory." The gaslighting was so blatant it was almost funny. After months of manipulation, surveillance, and legal maneuvering, Rachel was still trying to convince me that her actions had been motivated by concern rather than greed. "Help me by having me declared mentally incompetent?" I replied calmly. "Help me by trying to sell my house to developers who would tear it down? Help me by bringing in a corrupt professional who was being paid by the same company that wanted to buy my property?" Rachel's face went white. She clearly hadn't expected me to discover Dr. Henley's financial connections to Coastal Pacific Development. For a moment, her carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing the panic underneath. "That's not what happened," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Dr. Henley is a respected professional. Any consulting work she does is completely separate from her clinical practice." "Is that what you told yourself when you hired her?" I asked. "Or did you specifically seek out someone who had financial incentive to support your narrative about my mental health?" Rachel moved closer, and I could see the strain of the past few months in her face. The financial pressure, the legal problems, the stress of maintaining her deception had taken a visible toll. She looked older, more fragile, but also more dangerous in the way desperate people often became. "Emma, please," she said, her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd used as a child when she wanted something. "You don't understand what we're facing. David's legal problems, the money we owe, the people who are threatening us. We could lose everything. So you decided to take everything from me instead," I replied. "Destroy my reputation, my relationships with our family, my independence, just so you could pay your debts with my inheritance?" "It's not like that," Rachel insisted, but her protests sounded hollow even to her. "The house is too much for you. You said so yourself during our phone conversations. I was trying to find a solution that would help both of us. By lying to our parents about my mental health, by staging an intervention with a corrupt professional, by filing a guardianship petition that would have given you control over my entire life?" Rachel's composure finally shattered completely. She sank into the chair by the window, all pretense of righteous concern abandoned. When she looked up at me, her eyes were filled with tears that might have been genuine remorse or simply fear of consequences. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered. "It started as just trying to convince you to sell the house. But then, when you wouldn't listen and David's situation got worse, I thought maybe if you took a break from everything, stepped away from the stress, you'd see that letting go of the property was the right choice. And when I still wouldn't cooperate, you decided to have me declared incompetent so you could make the choice for me," I finished. Rachel didn't deny it. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of her betrayal filling the space between us. This was my sister, the person who had shared a bedroom with me for 15 years, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework. The same person who had been willing to destroy my life for money. "What happens now?" Rachel asked. "Finally." "Now you're going to withdraw the guardianship petition," I said. "You're going to provide a written statement to Adult Protective Services explaining that your concerns about my mental health were unfounded and motivated by personal financial problems. You're going to tell our parents the truth about why you really wanted me to sell the house. And if I don't?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and realized that the person I'd spent my life trying to please and accommodate no longer existed. maybe she never had. The Rachel sitting in my living room was a stranger who had systematically tried to destroy me for profit. "If you don't," I said calmly, "my attorney will file criminal charges for fraud, harassment, and conspiracy. Dr. Henley will lose her license for ethics violations, and I'll make sure everyone in your real estate community knows exactly what you attempted to do to your own sister." Rachel stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally recognizing that the quiet sister she'd always controlled was gone forever. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I'll withdraw the petition," she said. She left without another word, driving away from the house she'd tried so hard to steal. I watched from the porch until her car disappeared around the Y bend, then sat down on the steps where Grandma Rose used to shell peas on summer evenings. The next several weeks brought a series of phone calls and legal documents that systematically dismantled Rachel's case against my mental health. Dr. Henley's consulting relationship with Coastal Pacific Development became the subject of a state licensing board investigation. Adult Protective Services closed their file with a notation that the original concerns had been withdrawn by the reporting party. The guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. My parents called 3 days after Rachel withdrew her legal actions. The conversation was awkward and painful, filled with apologies that couldn't undo months of doubt about my competency and stability. They had believed Rachel's concerns because they wanted to believe she was looking out for my best interests. The revelation that she had been motivated by financial desperation and criminal conspiracy had shattered their trust in their eldest daughter. "We should have listened to you," Mom said through tears during our phone conversation. "We should have asked more questions, gotten your side of the story, paid attention to how happy and successful you were instead of focusing on imaginary problems." "You trusted the wrong person," I replied, and while I could forgive them for that mistake, I knew our family dynamics would never be the same. David's criminal trial began 2 months later. The securities fraud charges resulted in a 7-year prison sentence and restitution orders that would keep him financially ruined for decades. Rachel's real estate license was suspended pending. An ethics investigation related to her attempt to fraudulently gain control of my property. Their house went into foreclosure, and Rachel moved back in with our parents, a humiliating reversal that she had tried so desperately to avoid. I stayed in Grandma Rose's house, completing the renovations that had been interrupted by months of legal battles. My web design business continued to grow, eventually requiring me to hire 2 employees to handle the increasing demand. The Victorian home became both my sanctuary and my office, proof that I had been capable of managing both my professional and personal responsibilities all along. The hardest part wasn't the legal victory or the vindication of my competency. It was accepting that I had lost my sister forever, not to death or distance, but to greed and desperation that had revealed who she really was underneath the successful facade. The Rachel who had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent was the real Rachel, and the caring sister I'd believed in for 28 years had been an illusion. But in losing that illusion, I had gained something more valuable: absolute confidence in my own judgment and worth. Rachel's manipulation campaign had been designed to make me doubt my perception of reality, to question my ability to make good decisions, to believe that I needed other people to manage my life for me. Instead, it had taught me that I was stronger and more capable than I'd ever imagined. The house that Rachel had tried to steal became a symbol of my independence and resilience. Every room I renovated, every business success I achieved, every quiet evening I spent on the porch where Grandma Rose had taught me to trust my instincts was proof that I didn't need anyone's permission to live my life on my own terms. Sometimes, late at night when I was working in my office, I would remember the intervention where Dr. Henley had suggested I needed family support to make good decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family members who had claimed to want what was best for me had been the greatest threat to my well-being and autonomy. The quiet sister Rachel had always underestimated had learned to trust her own voice above all others. And that voice was telling me that I was exactly where I belonged, in the house my grandmother had trusted me to protect, building the life I had chosen for myself. Rachel never did apologize for what she had tried to do to me. Maybe she couldn't acknowledge the full scope of her betrayal without facing truths about herself that were too painful to accept. But her silence didn't matter anymore. I no longer needed her validation or approval to know my own worth. The last time I saw her was at Dad's birthday dinner 6 months after the legal proceedings ended. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of her choices. We were polite to each other for our parents' sake, but we both knew we would never be sisters again in any meaningful way. As I drove home to Bellingham that night, I felt grateful for everything that had happened, even the pain and fear and betrayal. Rachel's attempt to destroy me had ultimately freed me from caring what any of them thought about my choices. The approval I had spent years seeking from family members who didn't understand or value me had been replaced by self-respect that no one could take away. The Victorian house stood quietly in the moonlight as I pulled into the driveway, its windows glowing with the warm light of home. Inside, my office held the computers and client files that represented financial independence I had built with my own skills and determination. The garden bloomed with flowers Grandma Rose had planted, and I had learned to tend. Every corner of the house held evidence of my capability, my judgment, and my right to make my own decisions about my life. Rachel had tried to convince everyone that I was too fragile and unstable to manage my inheritance. Instead, she had proven that I was strong enough to fight a battle for my freedom and win it. The quiet sister had found her voice, and it was louder than all their doubts and manipulations combined. 2 years later, I stood in the same living room where Rachel had once tried to convince me I was mentally unstable, but everything had changed. The Victorian house had been featured in Pacific Northwest Home magazine as an example of successful historical preservation, with my renovation work praised for maintaining the original character while incorporating modern functionality. The article included photos of my home office, where I now managed a web design company with 12 employees and clients across 3 states. The irony wasn't lost on me that the property Rachel had dismissed as too much responsibility for someone with my alleged mental health issues had become the foundation of a business success that exceeded anything she had achieved in her real estate career. The house that was supposed to be evidence of my poor judgment had been appraised at over $600,000, a significant increase from the original inheritance value thanks to my careful renovations and the area's growing popularity. But the most profound changes weren't visible in magazine spreads or property assessments. They lived in the quiet confidence that had replaced years of seeking approval from people who had never truly known or valued me. The morning routine, that Rachel had once documented as evidence of instability, had evolved into a peaceful rhythm that started each day with coffee on the wraparound porch, watching the harbor while planning the day's work. My relationship with my parents had slowly rebuilt itself on a foundation of mutual respect rather than their previous assumptions about my capabilities. They visited Bellingham regularly now, staying in the guest room I'd created in what used to be Grandma Rose's sewing room. Dad spent hours helping with garden projects, finally understanding that my attention to detail wasn't obsessive behavior, but simply the same perfectionism that had made my business successful. Mom had struggled more with accepting her role in Rachel's manipulation campaign. During one of their visits, she'd broken down crying while helping me organize client files in my office. "I let her convince me you were fragile," she'd said through tears. "I'd watched you build a successful business, manage this renovation project, create a life you loved, and I still believed her when she said you were falling apart." The conversation had been painful but necessary. I'd explained that I didn't blame them for believing Rachel's carefully constructed narrative, but I needed them to understand that their doubt had been as damaging as her deliberate manipulation. They'd learned to see my independence as strength rather than isolation, my professional focus as dedication rather than obsession, my happiness as genuine rather than manic. The legal aftermath of Rachel's scheme had continued long after our final confrontation. Dr. Patricia Henley had lost her license to practice psychology after the state licensing board discovered not only her undisclosed financial relationship with Coastal Pacific Development, but also a pattern of similar ethical violations in other cases. The investigation revealed she had been taking consulting fees from multiple companies while providing supposedly neutral evaluations that supported their business interests. Coastal Pacific Development had faced their own legal troubles when the scheme to acquire my property through fraudulent guardianship proceedings became public. The company's reputation suffered enough damage that several other projects were canceled by municipalities who no longer trusted their community impact assessments. The luxury condominium development they'd planned for my neighborhood was permanently shelved, preserving the historic character of the waterfront area. Rachel's fall from grace had been swift and comprehensive. The real estate board's ethics investigation had resulted in the permanent revocation of her license, ending a career she'd spent years building. Without professional income and facing restitution payments related to David's criminal conviction, she'd been forced to take a job at a call center in Tacoma, a humiliating reversal from her previous lifestyle. David had been transferred to a minimum security federal prison in Oregon after pleading guilty to additional charges related to money laundering. His 7-year sentence had been extended to 12 years when investigators discovered he'd been running the securities fraud scheme for much longer than originally suspected. The restitution orders now exceeded $4 million, money that would never be recovered since most of it had been spent maintaining their lavish lifestyle. I'd heard through family conversations that Rachel blamed me for the extent of their legal troubles, claiming that if I'd simply sold the house as she'd originally suggested, none of the subsequent investigations would have occurred. The logic was typically Rachel. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her own wrongdoing, she managed to position herself as the victim of my stubbornness. But her bitterness no longer affected me the way it once would have. The sister, who had spent months trying to convince everyone I was mentally unstable, had revealed herself to be someone whose judgment was so compromised by desperation that she'd destroyed her own life pursuing money that was never hers to take. Her opinion of my choices carried no more weight than the critique of any stranger who didn't understand my values or priorities. The business I'd built from my home office had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when Rachel was documenting my work habits as evidence of obsessive behavior. Emma Collins Design now employed a full-time project manager, 2 senior developers, 3 junior designers, a content specialist, and an office manager. We'd moved the main operations to a restored warehouse space in downtown Bellingham, but I still maintained my home office for special projects and client meetings that benefited from the peaceful, creative atmosphere of the Victorian house. The success had attracted attention from larger companies interested in acquiring my business, offers that would have made me wealthy enough to live anywhere I wanted. But I'd learned something important during the battle for my independence. Financial success meant nothing if it required abandoning the life I'd chosen for myself. The house, the community, the rhythm of work and rest I'd established here were worth more than any buyout package. Mike Rodriguez had become more than just a helpful neighbor during this journey. Our friendship had deepened through the crisis with Rachel, and over the past year it had evolved into something that might eventually become love. But I was in no hurry to define or formalize the relationship. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions about romance based on what brought me joy rather than what others expected or approved of. Mike understood my need for independence in a way that felt comfortable rather than threatening. He had his own successful contracting business, his own renovated historic home 3 blocks away, his own circle of friends and interests. When we spent time together, it was because we chose to, not because either of us needed the other to feel complete or validated. The contrast with my previous relationship patterns was striking. I'd spent years seeking partners who would provide the approval and validation I couldn't get from my family, men who would reassure me that I was worthy of love, despite my supposed fragility. Those relationships had been built on my insecurities, rather than my strengths, and they'd inevitably failed when partners realized I needed them to fix problems that didn't actually exist. With Mike, I brought my whole self to the relationship: the successful business owner, the capable homeowner, the woman who had fought a legal battle for her independence and won. He'd watched me handle the crisis with Rachel with a combination of strategy and grace that had impressed rather than intimidated him. Our connection was based on mutual respect between equals rather than one person rescuing the other. The local community had rallied around me during the legal proceedings in ways that still surprised me. Neighbors I barely knew had offered to provide character witness statements. Local business owners had shared their own positive experiences working with my company. The owner of the Blue Anchor Cafe had even organized a letter-writing campaign to Adult Protective Services, explaining that I was a valued community member whose presence had strengthened the neighborhood. Their support had been more meaningful than any family approval I'd ever sought. These people had no obligation to defend me, no family loyalty to motivate their actions. They'd simply observed my life and work and determined that the allegations against my mental health were inconsistent with the competent, contributing community member they knew me to be. The experience had taught me something profound about where real validation comes from. The approval I'd spent years seeking from family members who didn't understand my choices was less valuable than the respect I'd earned from people who had witnessed my actual character and capabilities. Community belonging wasn't inherited through blood relationships. It was earned through consistent actions and authentic connections. I'd also learned to trust my own judgment about people and situations in ways I'd never managed before Rachel's betrayal. The quiet intuition that had warned me something was wrong during her manipulation campaign had proven more reliable than any external authority figure's assessment of my mental state. The sister I'd spent years trying to please had been willing to destroy me for money, while my own instincts had been consistently accurate about the danger she represented. This shift in self-trust had affected every aspect of my life. Business. Decisions that once would have required extensive consultation and validation from others now came naturally. I'd learned to recognize my own expertise and act on it with confidence. Client relationships were stronger because I no longer needed their approval to feel worthy. I simply provided excellent service because that reflected my professional standards. The house itself had become a symbol of this transformation. Every room I'd renovated represented a choice I'd made based on my own vision rather than others' expectations. The home office, where I'd once worried about appearing too isolated, now hosted video conferences with clients from across the country. The kitchen, where Rachel had questioned my ability to manage basic household responsibilities, now catered business lunches for my growing team. But perhaps the most significant change was in the guest room where my parents now stayed during their visits. It had once been Grandma Rose's sewing room, a space where she'd created beautiful quilts while sharing stories about family history and personal strength. I'd preserved her antique sewing machine and some of her fabric collection, while adding a comfortable bed and modern amenities for visitors. The room bridged past and present in a way that felt symbolic of my own journey. Grandma Rose's wisdom and independence had laid the foundation for my ability to stand up to Rachel's manipulation. Her decision to leave me the house hadn't just been about property transfer. It had been about recognizing and nurturing the strength she'd seen in me since childhood. During their last visit, Mom had sat at Grandma Rose's sewing machine, running her fingers over the worn wood and intricate metalwork. She knew, Mom had said softly. She knew Rachel would try something like this, and she knew you'd be strong enough to fight it. The observation had surprised me because I'd never thought about Grandma Rose's inheritance decision as strategic rather than simply preferential. But as I'd reflected on her words and actions during her final months, I'd realized she'd been preparing me for exactly the battle I'd ended up fighting. The stories she'd told about family strength and independence, the emphasis on trusting my own judgment, the careful documentation of her wishes. It had all been designed to give me the tools I'd need to protect what she was leaving me. The legal victory over Rachel had been satisfying, but the personal victory over my own insecurities had been transformative. I no longer needed anyone's permission to live my life on my own terms. The approval I'd once sought from family members, who didn't understand my choices, had been replaced by self-respect that couldn't be shaken by others' opinions or manipulations. Sometimes, when I was working late in my office or reading on the porch in the evening, I would think about the person I'd been before Rachel's scheme forced me to fight for my independence. That version of myself had been capable and successful, but still fundamentally uncertain about her worth and judgment. She'd built a good life, but always with one eye on what others thought about her choices. The woman who had emerged from that battle was someone I barely recognized, but thoroughly respected. She made decisions based on her own values and priorities. She trusted her instincts and acted on them with confidence. She surrounded herself with people who appreciated her authentic self rather than trying to fix her imaginary problems. The quiet sister Rachel had tried to have declared mentally incompetent had found her voice and learned to use it with precision and power. But more importantly, she'd learned that true strength didn't require volume or drama. Sometimes the most powerful response to manipulation and betrayal was simply refusing to be diminished by them. Standing in my living room on this anniversary morning, I felt grateful for everything that had happened, even the pain and fear and betrayal. Rachel's attempt to destroy my independence had ultimately freed me to claim it more completely than I'd ever imagined possible. The house she'd tried to steal had become the foundation of a life built entirely on my own terms. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was a potential client calling about a website redesign for their nonprofit organization. As I discussed their needs and my company's capabilities, I realized I was speaking with the same confidence and expertise that Rachel had once tried to paint as manic obsession. The difference was that now I recognized these qualities as professional strengths rather than symptoms of instability. After ending the call, I walked out to the porch where I'd drunk coffee every morning for 2 years, watching the harbor and planning my days with the peace of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. The Victorian house stood solid and beautiful around me, proof that I'd been right to fight for the life I'd chosen. Rachel had tried to convince everyone that I was too fragile to handle my inheritance. Instead, she'd proven that I was strong, enough to protect it from people who would destroy it for profit. The sister who had underestimated me for 28 years had finally learned what happened when the quiet one decided to fight back. And the victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were too young, too inexperienced, too emotional, or too different to make good decisions about their own lives. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with grand gestures, but with quiet persistence and unwavering faith in your own worth. The unexpected knock on my door came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, exactly 3 years after Rachel's guardianship petition had been dismissed. I was reviewing quarterly reports for my design company, spreadsheets showing revenue growth that had exceeded every projection I'd made when starting the business from this very room. The sound of footsteps on the porch was unfamiliar, too light to be Mike, and too hesitant to be any of my neighbors who had become comfortable dropping by without formal invitation. Through the window, I could see a figure hunched against the rain, collar turned up, and face obscured by shadows. Something about the posture seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it until I opened the door and found myself face to face with Rachel for the first time since our confrontation in this same living room. She looked nothing like the polished real estate agent who had once commanded every room she entered. Her hair was shorter and streaked with premature gray, her clothes practical rather than designer, her face lined with stress and exhaustion that added years to her appearance. Most striking was the absence of her trademark confidence, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty that made her seem smaller somehow. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," she said without preamble, water dripping from her jacket onto the porch boards. "But I needed to talk to you, and I didn't know how else to approach this." I stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying this woman who had once tried to destroy my life. 3 years ago, her presence would have triggered anxiety and anger. Now I felt only a distant curiosity about what could have brought her to my door after everything that had happened between us. "What do you want, Rachel?" I asked, neither inviting her in nor closing the door. "To apologize," she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been practicing them. "And to explain some things that you have a right to know, even if you decide you never want to see me again after tonight." The rain was coming down harder, and despite everything she'd done, I couldn't bring myself to leave anyone standing in the weather. I stepped back and gestured for her to come inside, a decision I might have questioned 3 years earlier, but now made with the confidence of someone who knew she could handle whatever came next. Rachel entered the house cautiously, looking around the living room that had been the site of so many of our family's conflicts. The space looked different now, warmer and more lived in than during her previous visit. My business success had allowed me to add personal touches that reflected my interest rather than Grandma Rose's decorating choices, while still honoring the house's historical character. "The house looks amazing," Rachel said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice rather than the calculating assessment I remembered from before. "You've really made it your own." "Thank you," I replied simply, settling into the chair across from the couch where she had positioned herself. "What did you want to apologize for?" The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd expected me to make this conversation easier by filling the silence with small talk or polite inquiries about her life. When I remained quiet, waiting for her to explain herself, she took a shaky breath and began. "For everything," she said. "For trying to manipulate you. For lying to our family about your mental health. For bringing Dr. Henley into it. For the surveillance. For the guardianship petition. For trying to steal your inheritance and destroy your reputation to solve my own problems." The list was comprehensive but delivered without emotion, like someone reciting items from a grocery list, rather than confessing to devastating betrayals. I realized she was probably nervous, maybe even afraid of how I might react to seeing her again. "That's a good start," I said. "But apologizing for what you did isn't the same as understanding why you did it or taking responsibility for the consequences." Rachel's composure cracked slightly, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "I know that. I've spent the last 3 years in therapy trying to understand how I became someone capable of treating my own sister that way. I wanted to come here sooner, but my therapist said I needed to do the work of examining my behavior before I had any right to ask for your forgiveness." The mention of therapy interested me. During our family intervention, Rachel had positioned herself as the mentally stable sister concerned about my psychological well-being. Now she was acknowledging that she had been the one who needed professional help to address her destructive behavior patterns. "What did you learn in therapy?" I asked, genuinely curious about whether she had gained any real insight into her actions. Rachel was quiet for several minutes, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she looked up, her expression held a vulnerability I'd never seen from her before. "That I've spent my entire life building an identity around being better than you," she said, the words coming out slowly as if each one was difficult to speak. "Prettier, more successful, more socially acceptable, more deserving of our parents' pride and attention. When you inherited Grandma Rose's house, it challenged everything I believed about my place in our family hierarchy." The admission was more honest than anything Rachel had ever said to me, but it also revealed the depth of her resentment in ways that were painful to hear. She'd spent decades defining herself in opposition to me, measuring her worth by how much more she achieved than her younger sister. But the inheritance was just the trigger, she continued. The real problem was that my entire sense of self was built on external validation and material success. When David's legal problems threatened to destroy our financial status, I lost my identity completely. I didn't know who I was if I wasn't the successful sister with the wealthy husband and the perfect life. I could understand the psychological dynamic she was describing, even if I couldn't excuse the actions that had resulted from it. Rachel had constructed a persona that required constant maintenance and validation, leaving her vulnerable to complete collapse when circumstances changed. "So you decided to tear down my life instead of examining your own choices," I said. "Yes," Rachel replied without hesitation. "It was easier to blame you for being difficult and unstable than to face the fact that my marriage was falling apart, because my husband was a criminal, and my career was built on manipulating people rather than genuinely helping them." The self-awareness in her response surprised me. This wasn't the defensive, justifying Rachel I remembered from our family dynamics. Therapy had apparently taught her to recognize and articulate her destructive patterns, though whether that translated to genuine change remained to be seen. "When David got arrested and our assets were frozen, I felt like my entire identity disappeared overnight," she continued. "I wasn't the successful real estate agent anymore. I wasn't the wealthy wife. I wasn't even the responsible older sister. I was just someone whose life had been revealed as a lie." "So you tried to make my life a lie too," I observed. Rachel nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I convinced myself that if I could prove you were unstable and irresponsible, it would somehow restore the natural order where I was the competent sister and you were the one who needed help. I thought if I could get control of your inheritance, I could solve my financial problems and go back to being the person I thought I was supposed to be." The explanation made psychological sense, but it also revealed how completely Rachel had misunderstood both of us. She'd seen my independence and success as threats to her identity rather than evidence that we could both thrive in our own ways. Her sense of worth had been so dependent on being superior to me that my happiness and competence had become intolerable. "What I didn't understand then," Rachel said, "was that the person I thought I was supposed to be was making me miserable. The constant competition, the need to always be performing success, the way I had to put other people down to feel good about myself. I was exhausted all the time, but I didn't know how to stop." This insight seemed genuine, but I found myself wondering if it was complete. Rachel had always been skilled at presenting herself in whatever light seemed most advantageous. Was this vulnerability authentic, or was it another manipulation designed to earn my sympathy and forgiveness? "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "What do you want from me?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider her words carefully. "I want you to know that what I did to you wasn't about anything you did wrong or any real problems with your mental health. It was about my own insecurity and desperation. You deserved better from me, and you deserved better from our parents who believed my lies about you." The acknowledgement felt important, even if it couldn't undo the damage that had been done. For months, I'd questioned whether there might have been some truth to Rachel's concerns about my behavior, whether I'd somehow contributed to the crisis that had nearly destroyed my independence. "I also want you to know that I don't expect forgiveness," Rachel continued. "I understand that some things can't be repaired, and that trust, once broken the way I broke it, might never be rebuilt. I'm not here to ask you to have a relationship with me or to pretend that we can go back to being sisters the way we were before." The statement was both relieving and sad. I had no desire to return to our previous family dynamics, but hearing her acknowledge that those relationships were permanently changed felt like a final ending to something that had shaped my entire childhood. "What I hope," Rachel said, "is that you can eventually find a way to not hate me, not for my sake, but for yours. Carrying anger towards someone who hurt you as badly as I hurt you can become a burden that affects your own happiness." I considered this perspective, realizing that I hadn't thought about Rachel with active anger for many months. The fury and hurt that had motivated my legal fight against her had gradually faded into something more like sad acceptance of who she had revealed herself to be. "I don't hate you," I said, surprised to discover this was true. "I'm disappointed. in who you chose to be. And I'm sad about what we lost because of your choices. But I don't hate you." Rachel's relief was visible, tension leaving her shoulders as if she'd been holding her breath for 3 years, waiting to hear those words. "There's something else," she said. "I want you to know what happened to Dr. Henley and the people at Coastal Pacific Development who were part of the scheme to get your property. I'd followed some of the legal proceedings through news reports, but I was curious to hear what Rachel knew about the broader consequences of the conspiracy she'd initiated. Dr. Henley lost her license permanently and was charged with fraud, in connection with other cases where she'd taken money from companies while providing supposedly neutral evaluations," Rachel explained. She pled guilty and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Her psychology practice was completely destroyed, and she'll never be able to work in mental health again. The justice felt appropriate, though I took no pleasure in anyone's professional destruction. Dr. Henley had corrupted her position of trust and authority for financial gain, causing harm not just to me but to other vulnerable people who had relied on her supposed expertise. Coastal Pacific Development faced a federal investigation that uncovered systematic corruption in their land acquisition practices, Rachel continued. They'd been using similar tactics in other communities, bribing local officials and manipulating environmental impact studies to get approval for developments that violated zoning laws. I hadn't known about the broader pattern of corruption, though it made sense that my case hadn't been their first attempt at fraudulent property acquisition. The company was dissolved, and several executives were charged with racketeering, Rachel said. The investigation revealed that they'd been planning to use your property as a model for similar developments throughout the Pacific Northwest, destroying historic properties to build luxury condominiums that local communities didn't want. The scope of what had been prevented by my successful defense of the guardianship petition was staggering. My individual battle for independence had inadvertently protected other families and communities from similar schemes. "I know this doesn't change what I did to you," Rachel said, "but I'm glad that fighting my attempt to steal your inheritance ended up stopping something much bigger and more destructive." The conversation was providing closure I hadn't realized I needed. For 3 years, I'd known that justice had been served in my individual case, but understanding the broader impact of that victory added another layer of meaning to the struggle I'd endured. "What about you?" I asked. "What's your life like now?" Rachel's smile was rueful but seemed genuine, very different from what it was before. "I work at a nonprofit organization that helps people navigate bankruptcy and foreclosure proceedings. The pay is terrible compared to what I used to make in real estate, but the work feels meaningful in a way that selling houses never did." The career change seemed appropriate, almost poetic in its connection to the financial crisis she'd tried to solve by stealing my inheritance. "I live in a small apartment in Olympia," she continued. "No designer clothes, no expensive car, no wealthy husband to provide the lifestyle I thought I needed. But I'm not miserable the way I was when I had all those things." The transformation sounded significant, but I wondered how much of it was forced by circumstances versus chosen through genuine personal growth. Rachel had lost the external markers of success that had defined her identity, but whether she'd truly found a healthier way of understanding her worth remained unclear. "Do you ever miss the old life?" I asked. "I miss the financial security," Rachel admitted. "Not having to worry about money, being able to buy what I wanted without checking my bank account first. But I don't miss the constant pressure to maintain an image that never felt authentic to who I really was." This distinction seemed important, suggesting that Rachel's changed circumstances had forced her to discover aspects of herself that had been buried under years of performance and competition. "I also don't miss the way I treated people when I was focused on staying ahead of everyone else," she said, "including you. Especially you. The sister I was for most of our lives was not someone I'm proud of, and I'm trying to learn how to be different." The acknowledgement felt significant, though I remained cautious about accepting it at face value. Rachel had spent decades perfecting the art of presenting herself in whatever light served her purposes. Her apparent self-awareness and remorse could be genuine, or they could be another sophisticated manipulation designed to rehabilitate her image in my mind. "I should go," Rachel said, standing up from the couch. "I know this was a lot to process, and I don't want to overstay my welcome. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did to you was wrong, and that none of it was your fault." I walked her to the door, feeling emotionally drained by the conversation, but also oddly peaceful. The anger and hurt I'd carried about Rachel's betrayal hadn't disappeared completely, but it had transformed into something more manageable and less toxic to my own well-being. "Rachel," I said as she prepared to leave, "I'm glad you came by. I'm glad you're getting help, and I hope you continue to grow from whatever you've learned about yourself." She turned back to face me, tears in her eyes again. "Thank you for listening. And Emma, I'm genuinely proud of what you've built here. The business, the house, the life you've created for yourself. You were always stronger and more capable than I gave you credit for, and I'm sorry it took losing you as a sister for me to recognize that." After she left, I sat on my porch despite the rain, thinking about the strange circular nature of our family story. The sister who had once tried to have me declared mentally incompetent had come to my door seeking emotional healing for herself. The person who had attempted to steal my inheritance had ended up working to help other people recover from financial disasters. Whether Rachel's transformation was complete or permanent remained to be seen, but her visit had provided something I hadn't expected. Confirmation that my victory over her manipulation campaign had been even more significant than I'd realized. I hadn't just protected my own inheritance and independence, I'd helped expose a criminal conspiracy that had been harming communities throughout the region. More importantly, I'd proven to myself that I could face even the most devastating betrayal and emerge stronger rather than broken. The quiet sister Rachel had tried to silence had found her voice and learned to use it with precision and power. The supposedly fragile woman she'd tried to have declared incompetent had built a life of independence and success that no one could take away. Standing in the rain outside the house that had been the center of our battle, I felt grateful for everything that had happened, even the pain and fear and betrayal. Rachel's attempt to destroy my independence had ultimately taught me how strong I really was. Her effort to steal my inheritance had forced me to fight for the life I wanted and discover that I was capable of protecting it. The Victorian house stood solid and beautiful around me, proof that I'd been right to trust my own judgment about what mattered most. The business I'd built had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible when Rachel was documenting my work habits as evidence of mental instability. The community I'd joined had embraced me as someone capable of contributing rather than someone who needed to be managed or protected. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that real strength didn't require anyone else's validation or approval. The power to define my own worth and make my own choices had been mine all along. I just needed to learn to claim it and defend it when necessary. Rachel's visit had been the final chapter in a story that began with her attempt to convince everyone I was too unstable to manage my own life. 3 years later, she was the one seeking help, while I was the one offering grace from a position of strength and security. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd been completely rebuilt on a foundation of truth rather than manipulation. Walking back into my house, I felt ready to close this chapter of my life completely. Rachel's apology and explanation had provided the closure I hadn't realized I needed, but they had also confirmed something more important. I no longer needed anything from her or anyone else in my family to feel complete and worthy. The quiet sister had not only found her voice, she'd learned to trust it above all others. And that voice was telling her that she was exactly where she belonged, living exactly the life she'd chosen, surrounded by people who valued her authentic self rather than trying to fix her imaginary problems. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.